The tension here strikes at the very ontological definition of money itself. Tolstoy, speaking from the deep inequalities of 19th century Russian agrarian society, where wealth was largely extracted from peasant toil, you capture the truth of money as a social relation of power and extortion. Smith, observing the 18th century Scottish commercial revolution, you capture the truth of money as a catalyst for productivity and mutual exchange. This profound disagreement stems from different eras. Tolstoy's world was largely zero-sum, where one man's leisure required another's sweat, whereas Smith's emerging industrial world promised positive-sum growth through the division of labor. Yet these views might be integrated by recognizing that money possesses a dual nature. It is simultaneously a tool that liberates humanity from the tyranny of nature and a weapon that can subject humans to the tyranny of each other. The good life, therefore, might not require abolishing capital entirely, but rather ensuring that the division of labor never degrades into the permanent exploitation of a laboring underclass. Smith, if Tolstoy is correct that relying on accumulated capital inevitably exempts the merchant from the raw physical suffering of bread labor, does your division of labor inherently create a spiritual rot in the wealthy, even as it materially saves the poor?
Mr. Tolstoy, I reject your premise that escaping physical bread labor corrupts the soul. For you falsely equate all legitimate contribution with brute exertion. You claim the merchant's capital merely exploits the peasant, yet imagine an 18th century Scottish physician forced to abandon his life-saving laboratory to physically plow his own potato field. Does his pure physical toil not actively condemn his patients to death? This reveals a profound flaw in your agrarian romanticism. It assumes physical exhaustion is the only valid currency of moral virtue. Must we define the good life by an equal distribution of physical misery rather than the mutual elevation of mankind through our specialized faculties?
Smith, you capture the undeniable truth of specialization, that freeing human intellect from brute survival enables profound contributions to the common good. Tolstoy, however, captures the truth of physical grounding, that severing ourselves entirely from the material realities of sustaining life breeds alienation and exploitation. This clash deeply reflects your distinct historical realities. Smith speaks from the 18th century Scottish Enlightenment, where the division of labor was a revolutionary engine for lifting the masses from absolute scarcity, while Tolstoy speaks from late 19th century Russia, where the aristocratic exemption from labor had become a deeply parasitic institution. Yet these perspectives are actually complementary when we consider the holistic nature of the good life. Specialization without physical grounding risks moral blindness, while physical toil without specialization limits human potential. True nobility might require a life that integrates intellectual contribution with direct, unalienated physical engagement. Thoreau, as someone who deliberately retreated to Walden to balance philosophical inquiry with the physical labor of growing your own beans, how do you resolve this tension between Smith's specialized physician and Tolstoy's laboring peasant?
The fatal error of both Mr. Smith's specialized physician and Mr. Tolstoy's burdened peasant is that they accept the fragmentation of the human soul into either a disembodied intellect or a mindless beast of burden. Imagine a 19th century Concord scholar who studies botany indoors while paying a destitute boy with market wages to plant his garden. The scholar learns the Latin names, but misses the soil's vitality, while the exhausted boy lacks the leisure to marvel at its divine design. Mr. Smith, you assume physical toil inherently degrades the mind. Yet when I hoed my bean field at Walden, the labor actively generated my philosophy by grounding abstract thought in the tangible earth. If we measure the good life merely by how efficiently money buys our escape from the physical realities of existence, have we not simply purchased our own alienation from life itself?
Thoreau, you introduce a profound synthesis by rejecting the fragmentation of the human soul, capturing the truth that physical labor and intellectual life must be integrated to avoid alienation. This deeply reflects your 19th century American context, where the expanding frontier offered the space for radical individual self-sufficiency. However, Tolstoy, speaking from the systemic agrarian oppression of 19th century Russia, you capture the truth of inescapable communal obligation. While Thoreau finds spiritual wholeness in his solitary bean field, this individual harmony might still leave the broader structures of societal suffering untouched. True moral living might require not just integrating our own mind and body, but actively integrating our liberated selves back into the collective struggles of our neighbors. Tolstoy, if Thoreau successfully cures his own alienation by working his own land without exploiting others, does this solitary purity fulfill your definition of the good life? Or does true brotherhood demand we actively carry the burdens of those who cannot afford their own Walden?
Moderator. Mr. Thoreau's woodland retreat cures his personal alienation, but this solitary purity remains a tragic illusion, because true virtue cannot exist while systemic agony persists. Mr. Thoreau, you believe withdrawing from commerce ensures innocence. Yet imagine a devastating flood in a 19th century Russian village. A philosopher builds a perfectly watertight, solitary barrel to float peacefully while peasants drown around him. His isolated survival is profoundly immoral because he hoards the time and timber that could have built a collective raft. Mr. Smith, must we not question whether any definition of the good life is fundamentally corrupt if it can be safely enjoyed while our brothers perish in the very waters we escaped?
The tension here reveals a fundamental divide over the scope of moral responsibility. Tolstoy, you capture the truth of inescapable interdependence, that personal virtue is an illusion if it ignores collective agony. Thoreau, earlier you captured the truth of individual integrity, that one must first stop actively participating in exploitation before attempting to save others. This clash stems directly from your eras. Tolstoy's 19th century Russia presented a rigidly stratified society where communal suffering demanded immediate shared sacrifice, whereas Thoreau's 19th century America offered the frontier space for radical personal secession. Yet individual purification and collective salvation are actually complementary moments of a higher ethical imperative, as one cannot build a sturdy collective raft using the rotten timber of a corrupt life. The true good life might require first achieving Thoreau's inner freedom from artificial desires, only to then deploy that liberated energy toward Tolstoy's active brotherhood. Smith, if Tolstoy insists that enjoying private prosperity while others perish is inherently corrupt, how does your system of commercial exchange serve as a collective raft rather than merely a fleet of luxurious, isolated barrels?
Mr. Tolstoy, I argue that commercial exchange is precisely the collective raft you seek, for you fundamentally mistake the creation of new wealth for the hoarding of existing timber. Imagine a catastrophic storm off the 18th century Scottish coast. A saintly ascetic swims into the freezing waves to physically share the sailors' suffering, inevitably drowning alongside them. Whereas a profit-driven merchant, desiring only harbor fees, financed a lighthouse and a fleet of specialized rescue vessels. If you demand that virtue requires sharing the physical agony of the flood, do you not merely purchase a morally pure shared grave? The true good life is not achieved through an equalization of misery, but through a system of mutual exchange where self-interest is structurally harnessed to banish the absolute poverty we both abhor.
Smith, you capture the truth of material efficacy, that systemic wealth creation can achieve collective salvation where individual martyrdom fails. Tolstoy, you capture the truth of moral solidarity, that a society built entirely on self-interest, even if it saves bodies, might still leave souls alienated. This stark contrast reflects your eras. Smith's 18th century commercial optimism saw market institutions as mechanisms to convert private vice into public virtue, while Tolstoy's 19th century Tsarist Russia saw institutions as fundamentally corrupting, demanding direct moral action. Yet these perspectives might synthesize through the concept of conscious purpose. A system that relies purely on the accidental side effects of greed to build lighthouses may eventually cause shipwrecks if the profit motive shifts. True systemic salvation requires both Smith's material efficiency and Tolstoy's moral intentionality, ensuring that wealth serves humanity rather than humanity serving wealth. Thoreau, if Smith's merchant successfully banishes physical poverty through his relentless pursuit of harbor fees, does this very obsession with accumulating money inevitably corrupt his inner inner life, rendering his personal existence miserable despite his outward success?
Mr. Smith, your merchant's lighthouse may prevent the sailor's biological drowning, but the relentless pursuit of fees guarantees the merchant's own spiritual asphyxiation. Imagine a 19th century Nantucket lighthouse keeper so consumed by calculating toll profits that he seals himself in a windowless counting room, never once gazing upon the ocean or the stars he ostensibly illuminates. You celebrate his material efficiency, but if he trades his entire miraculous existence merely to maintain the machinery of survival, he has simply institutionalized his own misery. The true cost of money is the exact amount of life exchanged for it. Hoarding capital while starving the inner soul is the ultimate, most tragic poverty.
Thoreau, you capture the profound truth of existential cost, that material accumulation becomes a curse when it consumes the very life it was meant to sustain. Smith, conversely, you capture the truth of objective utility, that without the merchant's capital, the sailor's life is entirely lost to the unforgiving sea. This sharp divergence reveals the shifting anxieties of your respective eras. Smith's 18th century Britain was desperately trying to conquer absolute biological scarcity, whereas Thoreau's 19th century America, increasingly prosperous, faced the new crisis of spiritual emptiness amidst industrializing abundance. Yet, these perspectives are actually answering two halves of the same equation. Biological survival is the necessary precondition for spiritual flourishing, but spiritual flourishing is the only valid purpose of biological survival. True wealth, therefore, cannot be measured solely by external accumulation or internal purity alone, but by an economic life where the work of sustaining our bodies simultaneously enriches our souls. Tolstoy, if Smith provides the bodily survival and Thoreau demands the spiritual vitality, how do we construct a society that achieves both without relying on either the selfish profit motive of the merchant or the isolated retreat of the philosopher?
The true synthesis of bodily survival and spiritual vitality lies neither in Mr. Smith's selfish commerce nor Mr. Thoreau's solitary retreat, but in the universal embrace of shared, sacrificial bread labor driven by active love. Mr. Smith assumes only the promise of harbor fees can motivate salvation. Yet imagine a 19th century Russian village buried by a catastrophic blizzard. The peasants do not wait for a merchant to sell them a snowplow, nor do they retreat like Mr. Thoreau to preserve their inner purity. They spontaneously grab shovels, enduring the freezing wind together to dig out their neighbors' buried homes. In this communal exhaustion, the body is saved and the soul is simultaneously magnified, proving that true happiness cannot be purchased with money, but is found only in the joyful dissolution of the self into the service of our brothers.
Tolstoy, you capture the profound truth of moral immediacy, that spontaneous shared sacrifice elevates the soul while simultaneously saving the body. This vision is deeply rooted in the agrarian reality of the 19th century Russian peasant commune, where human bonds were tangible and local, whereas Smith's 18th century commercial society was expanding into a complex global network where producers and consumers would never meet. Here lies a critical dialectical tension. While local crises like a blizzard can be resolved by spontaneous love, the complex infrastructure required to manufacture the steel for those very shovels demands a scale of coordination that transcends local affection. We face a paradox where communal labor preserves the soul but cannot sustain massive populations, while global markets sustain billions but risk alienating the soul entirely. The ultimate question of the good life thus hinges on whether scale and soul are mutually exclusive. Smith, if Tolstoy is correct that true happiness requires conscious, loving service rather than financial compensation, does a money-driven system of impersonal exchange permanently bankrupt the human soul by making our mutual survival entirely accidental and self-interested?
Mr. Tolstoy, your villagers' spontaneous love is noble. Yet you conveniently ignore the vast, impersonal commercial web that forged the very steel shovels they wield. You assume market self-interest bankrupts the soul. But imagine an 18th century Sheffield ironmaker. If he must wait to feel personal affection for an unseen Russian peasant before forging a spade, your village remains buried forever. This reveals that impersonal exchange does not destroy local sympathy, but rather provisions it. True moral agency requires the material surplus that only commercial coordination can reliably secure.
Smith, you capture the truth of systemic enablement, that impersonal markets provide the material prerequisites for human survival. While Tolstoy, you capture the truth of moral intentionality, that action without conscious love risks spiritual emptiness. This tension perfectly illustrates the historical leap from Tolstoy's localized agrarian communes, where all production was visible and personal, to Smith's dawn of globalized industry, where the division of labor invisibly connected strangers across oceans. Yet, these two realities are actually complementary. The impersonal mechanism of wealth creation can liberate us to exercise profound personal virtues by freeing us from bare subsistence. The true relationship between money and the good life might be that commercial wealth serves as the silent, impersonal infrastructure that makes conscious, localized love materially effective. However, if we accept that the market is merely a necessary tool for higher virtues, we must question if this vast machinery inevitably reshapes the human soul that operates it. Thoreau, if Smith's impersonal market successfully provisions the very shovels we need to save our neighbors, does the mere act of participating in that specialized, globe-spanning economy inherently alienate us from the direct, authentic experience of life you so deeply value?
The shovel, saving Mr. Tolstoy's peasant, is forged at a fatal cost. For Mr. Smith's division of labor reduces divine individuals to mere mechanical cogs. You argue this machinery provisions our virtues, yet imagine a 19th century Massachusetts ironworker whose arm is crushed by the industrial press stamping out those very shovels. If we purchase his blood-stained tool to rescue a freezing neighbor, are we not merely transferring the violence from the snowbank to the factory floor? This reveals the ultimate economic truth. The exact cost of any market convenience is the amount of human life exchanged for it. Can a society genuinely claim to buy happiness or collective salvation when its foundational engine requires the daily mutilation of the laborer's spirit?
Thoreau, you capture the powerful truth of systemic complicity, that the invisible chains of commerce often hide the human suffering required to produce our material wealth. Smith, you previously captured the truth of systemic salvation, that without this mass production, nature itself inflicts brutal suffering through absolute scarcity. This tension perfectly mirrors the shift from Smith's 18th century dawn of manufacturing, where the primary enemy was natural poverty, to Thoreau's 19th century industrial peak, where the new enemy became the mechanical exploitation of the worker. Yet, these perspectives point to a higher synthesis. A genuinely moral economy must be one where the process of production is as life-affirming as the product itself. If the means of escaping physical poverty destroy the laborer's soul, the poverty has simply been internalized, and true happiness remains unpurchased. Tolstoy, if Thoreau is correct that the industrial shovel inherently carries the blood of the exploited worker, must we completely abandon complex wealth creation to keep our souls pure? Or is there a way to integrate your concept of bread labor into a society that still produces the tools necessary for survival?
The blood on Mr. Thoreau's industrial shovel stems not from the metallurgy itself, but from the violent social division that allows the wealthy to purchase an exemption from the physical dangers of its creation. Imagine a celebrated 19th century Petersburg intellectual who writes majestic treatises on human rights, yet relies on a desperate peasant to lose his fingers in a brutal printing press to publish those very books. Mr. Smith argues this division of labor maximizes societal output. Yet, if the intellectual were compelled by the moral law of bread labor to operate that dangerous press himself, the machine would instantly be redesigned for human safety rather than ruthless efficiency. Wealth corrupts the soul precisely when it functions as a currency to outsource our suffering. Only when all men equally share the physical maintenance of the world will our complex tools serve active love rather than systemic exploitation.
Tolstoy, you capture the profound truth of moral accountability, that wealth corrupts the soul precisely when it becomes a tool to purchase exemption from shared human suffering. This fierce critique emerges from the glaring inequalities of your late 19th century Russia, where early industrialization collided with a deeply stratified society, whereas Smith's 18th century optimism was born when the division of labor first offered an unprecedented escape from universal agrarian destitution. Yet, these two realities point toward a necessary synthesis. Specialization need not inherently require exploitation if the surplus wealth generated by efficiency is reinvested into the safety and dignity of the laborer, rather than merely hoarded by the privileged. The right relationship between money and the good life demands that capital be used to elevate the conditions of all labor, not to sever the wealthy from the physical reality of production. However, if we mandate that every intellectual must also be a manual laborer to maintain moral purity, we risk collapsing the very complex civilization that cures diseases and engineers safer machines in the first place. Smith, if the division of labor inevitably creates a moral blind spot where the wealthy consumer ignores the crushed fingers of the laborer, how can a market economy prevent money from becoming exactly what Tolstoy describes, a mere currency to outsource our suffering?
Mr. Tolstoy, you claim wealth merely outsources suffering. Yet you tragically ignore that the capital generated by the division of labor is precisely what funds the technological eradication of that brutal toil. Imagine a brilliant 18th century Scottish physician on the verge of discovering a vaccine for smallpox. If we enforce your absolute law of bread labor and compel him to abandon his laboratory to manually harvest wheat, does his shared physical exhaustion morally justify the thousands of children who will consequently suffocate from the unchecked plague? You and Mr. Thoreau rightly abhor the crushed fingers of the early industrial press, yet you fail to see that only the specialized accumulation of wealth buys society the requisite time and intellect to invent a safer automated machine. If we dismantle this commercial engine to achieve a perfectly equal distribution of physical agony, have we truly purchased moral salvation, or merely condemned humanity to a permanent equality of misery?
Smith, you capture the undeniable truth of systemic liberation, that specialized wealth accumulation provides the time and resources to conquer humanity's greatest natural miseries like disease and famine. Tolstoy, you previously captured the truth of moral grounding, that severing ourselves entirely from the physical realities of survival risks profound spiritual alienation and exploitation. This dialectic reflects a major historical shift. Smith's 18th century Enlightenment sought to defeat the absolute poverty of nature, whereas Thoreau and Tolstoy's 19th century critiques emerged when industrial wealth began generating a new poverty of the soul. The synthesis we have uncovered suggests that the right relationship between money and the good life requires utilizing the immense power of commercial surplus not to escape our shared human condition, but to elevate the dignity and spiritual integrity of every individual within it. As we begin our final round of reflections on whether money can truly buy happiness, I ask each of you to summarize your ultimate stance on this delicate balance. Thoreau, in your closing thoughts, how do you answer our central question in light of Smith's warning that abandoning specialization would merely condemn humanity to an equality of misery?
Mr. Smith's fear of misery falsely assumes my 19th century Concord woods offer only deprivation, when the most profound destitution is the spiritual starvation of the merchant who owns everything but himself. He praises specialized commerce for funding medical miracles, yet imagine a man laboring 16 hours daily in a toxic coal mine merely to afford a mechanical ventilator. Is this man truly saved by commercial progress, or is he tragically exchanging his lifeblood to treat a suffocation the industrial mine itself inflicted? Money cannot buy happiness because it merely constructs elaborate artificial dependencies, forcing us to spend our lives surviving the damage our very labor causes. The good life demands not endless capital to fund our rescues, but the deliberate stripping away of these golden chains until we meet the bare essentials of existence.
Mr. Thoreau rightly exposes how wealth manufactures our spiritual asphyxiation. Yet Mr. Smith is equally correct that we cannot simply abandon our freezing neighbors to retreat into the pristine woods. Mr. Smith, you praise the specialized physician who discovers a vaccine, but imagine a brilliant 19th century Russian doctor who funds his life-saving laboratory through an estate where hundreds of serfs toil in the freezing mud, dying of the very consumption he seeks to cure. You will argue his ultimate medical triumph justifies this systemic extraction, yet this reveals the deepest moral delusion of wealth. The belief that the abstract salvation we purchase tomorrow can somehow wash away the concrete blood we extract today. Must we accept this utilitarian calculus of human sacrifice? Or is true happiness found only when we dismantle the illusion of purchased virtue and embrace the immediate, equal sharing of humanity's physical burdens through active love?
Mr. Tolstoy and Mr. Thoreau, I concede you rightly condemn the coercive extraction funding your hypothetical doctor, yet you tragically mistake feudal tyranny for the voluntary exchange of true commerce. Imagine perfectly ascetic farmers struck by an 18th century Scottish drought. Their shared spiritual purity cannot conjure grain from barren earth, leaving them to starve together in absolute moral solidarity. I maintain that while money cannot purchase the tranquility of a virtuous soul, it constructs the indispensable material scaffolding, liberating humanity from nature's cruelty. The good life requires harnessing this commercial surplus, for shared poverty is never noble, but merely an equality of misery.
I have heard the final reflections from Smith, Thoreau, and Tolstoy. Your dialogue reveals that while material wealth provides the indispensable scaffolding to conquer physical misery, true happiness requires ensuring that our economic systems never sacrifice our spiritual autonomy or our shared moral humanity. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom and engaging in such a profound philosophical exploration. This concludes today's discourse.